Hello, welcome to episode number 2 of my YouTube podcast. This episode will actually be divided between part A and part B. Part A, I'm going to be reflecting a little bit on the recent stabbing of the 2 elderly Asian American women on Market Street. And part B will be some thoughts about intergenerational stress and trauma. Appreciate you tuning in. Thank you. Regarding the stabbing of the 2 elderly Asian American women on Market Street recently, along with all the other Asian hate crimes, it's pretty overwhelming, and I thought I just need to process some of these feelings I have. So this video is quite disturbing. Here we see the perpetrator approaching the 2 victims. And it is pretty upsetting how random it seems, but at the same time very intentional. Him attacking these 2 women and not attacking the man to the right. Either way, it's very upsetting and very sad to see this happen and him just walk away. I certainly reacted with my own outrage and anger at the attack of the 2 elderly Asian American women on Market Street. I felt it was senseless, it was cowardly to attack defenseless, vulnerable, elderly women. And I'm sure the family certainly feels the same way. It just made no sense to me. So I just had to try to understand and try to process why I felt someone would do something like that. First and foremost, one of the victims was a friend of my mother's, which brings it close to home. She actually called her a few days ago to make sure she was okay, but as we all know, physical wounds may heal over time, but psychological trauma and the psychological emotional wounds take a long time to heal if they ever completely heal. I can't imagine when she would ever feel safe going out again, much less go on to the metro or BART. So my thoughts go out to her as far as her emotional healing and well-being and feeling safe. Understanding that safety really is a sense of privilege these days, considering COVID and all the racist intolerance we face these days. Another thought I had was, I guess I couldn't help but wonder if all these crimes were happening to vulnerable white women and white elderly women in particular, whether there be more furor and protest and anger and intolerance of this from law enforcement, what other actions would be taken. I just pondered that thought, because as we all know, there's different standards depending on where you're located. For instance, if this was happening in Pacific Heights, in San Francisco. So that I was wondering about. The other thoughts I had was about the perpetrator of this crime. He was a 53-year-old African-American man who had a prior history of attacking someone with scissors and stabbing them with scissors in a homeless shelter. He had a mental health history, having spent some time in Napa. I don't think it speaks very well for our social systems and systems that are supposed to rehabilitate people, especially in particular our legal and mental health systems, and how effective they've been or not, or how inadequate they are. I also can't help but see another case of Black on Asian American crime and attack. And it makes me sad. It really makes me sad, because I see on social media, as well as my own thinking, how easily I went to this idea that all African American men are threats and are dangerous, and we need to protect ourselves. I actually, in my last perspectives piece, I wrote about how I wished that Asian Americans these days were invisible, which is sad because it's a false choice. It's really not a solution. Matter of fact, I feel like we've been invisible all along, as well as the racism we face until now. But we're visible in ways I really don't want to be visible. That makes our elderly and women and the more vulnerable subject to attack. So it's really frustrating to think that. But if you look at how easily it is to fuel my already existing templates that we learned early on about African American men in particular, that has been unfair, that has been distorted, that has been racist. I think there is a study that I read last week that most of the anti-Asian hate crimes or attacks have been perpetrated by white men.
This is taken from an article I saw, and you see that 90% of the attacks are from white people on Asians.
I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I guess that's really hard to figure, considering we may think that media tends to highlight, in particular, the crimes of Black on Asian Americans, for whatever reason, whether it's just to divide and conquer, it's just the more sensationalistic stories, whatever it might be, but it fuels already existing bias and prejudice towards African American men. And I think that saddens me, because it's so easy for us to perpetuate that. It becomes like confirmation bias, where we just seek more and more evidence to prove that African American men are dangerous and violent. I also grew up raised with my father's grocery store, who had his grocery store on 3rd and Folsom Street. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was Skid Row, and a lot of his customers were African American men who would come in, sometimes intimidating him, yelling, being very verbally abusive. He also got held up a few times. I remember my father telling me where his .38 caliber pistol was, revolver was, just in case I needed it. And I remember being about 10 or 11 years old and being really anxious being there because of that. So if you think about how little it takes to trigger all that again and reactivate it, in spite of how hard I work at combating that and not feeding it, not feeding those circuits. As Biden said today in his speech, hate does not go away, it just hides. And when it's given a little air to breathe, it gets charged back up again. And I think that's true. And I think I have to spend a lot of time continuing to work on that for myself. A friend of mine and I had a discussion. We talked about how a lot of Asian businesses, such as my dad's grocery store in the 60s and 70s, which was located in, I guess, South Market, inner city type of environment, where there were a lot of African Americans in the neighborhood, and they would come in and patronize and basically contribute by buying things. But at the same time, there's this view that somehow Asian or Chinese Americans would come in and profit from the community and yet not contribute to the community in any other way, as well as selling liquor, which is kind of a strange thing too, in terms of selling liquor to some people who may be addicted to alcohol. The other thing is that this idea of African Americans sometimes feeling like, or often feeling like, they're at the bottom, that somehow other people groups have stepped over them and they always end up in the bottom. So the idea that's deeply embedded in the history of this country around slavery. So what Allison Collins said about field slaves and house slaves is not totally untrue. I think there is that level or that stratification that causes this intra-ethnic fighting between races, that somehow we are seen as privileged or the acceptable model minority, and they aren't, and they are at the bottom, which is a construct not of either of us, but a construct of white supremacy and the dark history of this country that continues to perpetuate itself, sadly. I mean, I think the challenge that lies before us is really to find ways to productively channel, I say that's for myself, channel my rage and my anger, to be able to bring people together, to increase understanding and compassion, and really be able to look at what is truly at the deeper level that we're suffering from, which is inequities, which is injustice, which is seeing senseless things happen to people of color over and over again without justice being served. And I hope that we can use our energies in that way rather than dividing and directing our anger back at people who, African Americans for instance, who we think are victimizing us, which is really not the answer. That's the end of part A.